10CM External Cause Code Decision Making webinar. Today's session will identify the fundamental elements required to classify the correct injury external cause codes, achieve familiarity with ICD 10CM decision tree process for coding external cause codes, and achieve familiarity with the CDC available for members to access beginning tomorrow on the ATS website. Attendees will receive 1.5 hours of continuing education units credit towards the CSTR recertification. Credit will be posted to your CSTR profile within 48 hours. If you have not received a copy of today's session slides, they will be emailed to you shortly and are also available on the website at the conclusion of today's webinar. We will be taking general questions throughout today's session. If you would like to ask a question, please send it to the presenter through the GoToWebinar control plan. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Holly Hedgard. Dr. Hedgard is an injury epidemiologist, public health physician, and the manager of the Injury Statistics Program in the Office of Analysis and Epidemiology at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, National Center for Health Statistics. Dr. Hedgard received her medical degree from the University of Colorado and trained in both surgery and preventative medicine. She has over 20 years of experience in injury epidemiology, surveillance methodology, and evaluation of emergency medical services and trauma systems. She has multiple presentations and publications and abstracts in her repertoire of contributions to trauma. Dr. Hedgard has worked extensively with the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, the National Violent Death Reporting System, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, the National Emergency Medical Services Information System, and the National Trauma Database. These contributions have led to the development and enhancement of surveillance systems for traumatic brain, motor vehicle traffic safety, child abuse, homicide, suicides, and the delivery of emergency and trauma health care in the United States. Today I would like to welcome Dr. Hedgard and turn the presentation over to her.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share some insights about the external cause codes in ICD-10-CM. I know this transition from ICD-9-CM to ICD-10-CM might seem overwhelming. I mean, after finally getting to the point of feeling comfortable with the ICD-9-CM codes, it might feel like a huge challenge to put the same effort into learning about the ICD-10-CM codes. But I'm hoping that through this webinar, you'll see that many of the concepts in the codes are essentially the same, just with new letters and numbers, that a lot of the things that were frustrating in ICD-9-CM have actually been simplified in ICD-10-CM, and that codes that were needed but not available in ICD-9-CM have been added in ICD-10-CM. So although there's a lot to learn, it's basically a process of building on what you already know. So next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'll go over some of the general differences between ICD-9-CM and ICD-10-CM as related to the external cause codes. And then I'll spend some time reviewing the code structure for the transportation-related codes. There's quite a few differences between 10-CM and 9-CM for the transportation codes. I'll also talk about some of the other external cause codes, but mostly just highlighting new codes or new concepts. And then I'll discuss some of the supplemental codes. And these are codes that capture information about blood alcohol level, activity, location, work status, that type of thing. And then finally, I'll briefly review the proposed ICD-10-CM external cause matrix. Next slide, please. So hopefully all of you have access to an ICD-10-CM coding manual. But if not, I want to share this website where the latest version of the ICD-10-CM is always available. The National Center for Health Statistics works in conjunction with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to update the ICD code list every year, and the latest version of the coding manual can always be found at this website. For the external cause codes, you'll want to focus on Chapter 20, although there are a few T codes in Chapter 19 that are also relevant as external causes. And just a word of warning, don't try to download the entire coding manual from this website. The entire manual is more than 1,500 pages, and Chapter 20 by itself is more than 100 pages. So either use the materials on this website as an electronic reference or be very selective in what you choose to print. So let's go over a general overview now of the differences between ICD 9CM and ICD 10CM as it relates to the external cause codes. So this table summarizes some of the major differences. So as you've likely heard already, ICD 10CM captures a lot more detail than ICD 9CM. And this is reflected in the number of codes there are to choose from. So for example, in ICD 9CM, there were approximately 1,300 codes related to external cause. In ICD 10CM, there are approximately 7,500 external cause codes, so nearly 6 times the number of codes that were in ICD 9CM. In ICD 9CM, the external cause codes were also known as E codes because the code began with the letter E. But in contrast, the external cause codes in ICD 10CM now start with the letters V, W, X, or Y. So you should no longer refer to the external cause codes as E codes. The term E codes in ICD 10CM, that is, the codes that begin with the letter E, now refer to codes that describe endocrine, metabolic, and nutritional disorders. So clearly, nothing related to injury. In ICD 9CM, the codes had 3 to 5 characters. And in ICD 10CM, some of the codes have up to 7 characters, again, because of the level of detail that's captured in the code. Additionally, some codes have an X character in the middle of the code, and the X character serves as a placeholder so that in the future, as new concepts are included, there are places to modify existing codes rather than add codes that are out of sequence or that don't fit the established code structure. In ICD 9CM, several of the mechanisms of injury, such as poisoning or effects of a foreign body and asphyxiation, were included in the external causes. But in ICD 10CM, these codes have been moved from the external cause chapter to the injury diagnosis chapter and are found as T codes. And I'll be talking about these in more detail a bit later. It's just important to note that there are some things that have traditionally been thought of as external causes that are now being found among the injury diagnoses. And I know that for many trauma registries, you don't include injuries that result from poisoning or foreign bodies or asphyxiation, so it might not be relevant for all of you. But in terms of the larger concept of injury, not just what's captured in a trauma registry, these other external causes are still relevant. So it's important to know how they operate in ICD 10CM. And finally, another big difference between ICD 9CM and ICD 10CM is that the child or adult abuse and maltreatment codes that were included as external causes in ICD 9CM are now included as injury diagnosis codes in ICD 10CM and are found as T codes in Chapter 19. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an example of the enhanced detail that's found in ICD 10CM compared to ICD 9CM. So here's a common code from ICD 9CM, E888.0, fall resulting in striking against a sharp object. The similar code in ICD 10CM is W01.110. So as you can see, there's a lot more detail included in the code. It's not just a fall, but a fall from the same level from slipping, tripping, and stumbling. And rather than simply striking against a sharp object, the sharp object is specifically described as glass. In this example, you can also see how the code structure has changed, with 6 characters now in the ICD 10CM code, where there are only 4 characters in the ICD 9CM code. So in the next 3 slides, I want to go over the broad categories of the external cause codes in ICD 10CM and show how they relate to the groups of codes in ICD 9CM. So next slide, please. So this first slide focuses on those codes that relate to unintentional or accidental injury. And in this table, the first column shows the broad category of cause of injury. The second column shows the ICD 10CM code range. And the third column shows the range of similar codes in ICD 9CM. I'm not going to go over all of these in detail, but I just want to highlight a few things. The first broad external cause category is transportation. And one thing to note in ICD-10-CM is that any external cause related to transportation starts with the letter V. So that's a handy thing to remember. If an injury event is transportation related, you need to look in the section of the coding manual that describes the V codes. The second broad external cause category is for injuries resulting from falls. And these types of codes are fairly similar between ICD-9-CM and ICD-10-CM, but with much greater specificity and detail in the ICD-10-CM codes. And the fall codes are captured in W00 to W19. The next two categories break up external causes into those from inanimate mechanical forces and those from animate mechanical forces, or essentially whether the force came from something that's not alive, such as a falling object, sports equipment, machinery, cut, pierce, firearms, etc., versus the force came from something that is alive, so being struck or bitten by another person or an animal or plant or bird of some type. So again, the codes in these two categories are similar to those seen in ICD-9-CM, just in much greater detail. And I'll talk more about these codes a little bit later. The remaining categories are all fairly straightforward. There's things that you've seen before if you've worked with the ICD-9-CM codes, and they show a lot of similarity between ICD-9-CM and 10-CM. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the broad categories of the external cause codes for intentional self-harm, assault, injuries of undetermined intent, and injuries resulting from legal intervention, operations of war, military operations, and terrorism. So one thing you might note is that all the codes related to intentional self-harm, the first row on this table, begin with an X, while the codes related to assault, which is the second row on this table, begin with either an X or a Y. So unlike any other category, the assault codes span 2 letters of the alphabet. All the other categories either are begin with a single type of letter. Next slide, please. So this last slide in this series highlights those external causes that I mentioned that are now covered using T codes. And the T codes are found in Chapter 19, the chapter on injury diagnoses, rather than Chapter 20, the chapter on external causes. And for some of these T codes, the intentionality of the event is important. For example, whether a person was injured from an accidental asphyxiation or from a suicide attempt or from an assault. And for those T codes where intentionality is important, the information about intentionality is captured in the 4th or 5th digit of the code. So even though in the previous 2 slides I divided the groups into unintentional and then intentional injuries, it's important to note that the T codes operate a little bit differently. The T codes I've shown here would be distributed throughout the previous 2 tables depending on the intentionality of the event. Next slide, please. So I'd like to move into the next topic now, which is looking at the transportation codes in a bit more detail. For those of you who might have attended part 1 of this webinar series, you might remember that I went over several decision trees that have been developed to help with coding motor vehicle traffic events in ICD-9-CM. And to use those decision trees, you had to consider a variety of things, such as whether a motor vehicle was involved, where the event occurred, did the event involve a single motor vehicle or more than one motor vehicle, and then what happened? I mean, did the car collide with something? Did it lose control and roll over? Was it a head-on collision? Did it hit a parked car? And it wasn't really until you've answered all these other questions about the event that you got around to asking who the injured person was. This made it pretty difficult to approach those ICD-9-CM codes. Next slide, please. So in ICD-10-CM, many of the concepts for assigning the codes for crashes involving land transportation have been simplified. Now the critical pieces of information are who was the injured person and what did they collide into, and then all the other details about the crash, such as whether the injured person was the driver or a passenger, or whether the event was traffic versus non-traffic. And just as a reminder about traffic and non-traffic, a traffic event is one that occurs on a public roadway. while a non-traffic event is one that occurs in some other location other than a public roadway. So something like a parking lot or a driveway or a private road or off-road, that type of location is considered a non-traffic event. So let's work our way through one of the transportation codes, and you'll see what I mean. So let's move to the next slide. So here's one of the transportation codes, V11.0. This code is used when a bicyclist collides with another bicyclist in a non-traffic area, so say in a parking lot or off-road. Next slide. So the starting letter V indicates it's transportation related. The next character, the second character, tells you who was hurt. That is the pedal cyclist. The third character indicates who they collided with. And in this case, it was another pedal cyclist. And then the next slide shows you that the fourth character is used for other details, such as if it was the pedal cycle driver, not a passenger, and whether or not the event was traffic or non-traffic, that sort of thing. So let's look at these transportation codes in a bit more detail. Let's move to the next slide. So this table focuses on the second character of the code, that is, the part of the code that identifies who was injured. For each type of person who was hurt, for example, a pedestrian, a pedal cycle rider, a motorcycle rider, etc., there's a range of codes that capture different types of events. So right off the bat, assigning transportation codes in ICD 10-CM is theoretically easier than in ICD 9-CM, because if you know who the injured person is, examples for what's included in each of these groups. That is, what's meant by pedestrian, what's meant by pedal cycle rider, what's meant by heavy transport vehicle, etc. And I would highly recommend reviewing those definitions to be sure you're selecting the best category to represent the person who's injured. Next slide. The second question in determining the appropriate transportation code is to identify who or what the injured person collided with. And this information is captured in the third character of the code. So this table shows the different values for the third character. So for example, in the code we just looked at, V11.0, a bicyclist that collides with another bicyclist. We know that the code we're looking for is in the range of V10 to V19 because the person who was injured was a bicyclist. And because we know our bicyclist collided with another bicyclist, we can narrow that down to V11 because the third character value that reflects a collision with a bicyclist is 1. If our bicyclist had collided with a car, the codes we would be looking at would be V13, V for transportation, 1 for bicyclist as the person who was hurt, and 3 because the bicyclist collided with a car. A couple other things to note on this slide. If the person who was injured ran into a fixed or stationary object, such as a tree or a highway median, you'd look for a third character of 7. And if there was no collision at all, for example, a car that rolled over without hitting anything, you'd look for a third character of 8. So in the case of a person in a rollover crash that didn't hit anything, you'd look at codes that begin with V48. V for transportation, 4 for a car occupant as the person who was hurt, and 8 for a non-collision event. Next slide, please. So just to finish up on the basic structure of the land transportation codes, as I mentioned, the fourth and sometimes the fifth characters capture even greater detail. And this is where the specific information about whether the person was a driver versus passenger is captured, whether the event was a traffic versus a non-traffic event, or whether a specific type of vehicle was involved. The fourth and fifth characters are much less structured than the first 3 characters, so I don't have a specific table for them. But in any event, the first 3 characters ought to get you pretty close to the right area in the coding manual to see the codes that are available for the type of event you're looking for. Next slide, please. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about some issues specific to pedestrian-related injuries. When we think of pedestrians, we typically think of people who are walking across the street and get hit by a car or a bicyclist. But it's important to remember that people who are changing a tire on a transport vehicle or are trying to fix a car that's broken down at the side of the road are also considered pedestrians, not occupants of the vehicle. The other thing I want to mention is that even though pedestrians are mentioned in the two tables I just showed you, the table about who the injured person is and the table about who or what the injured person collided with, people who collide into other people while walking are not considered transportation events. So, for example, if a person is walking along and bumps into another person and was injured, the appropriate code to use would be W51, accidental striking against or bumped into by another person, which is one of the animate mechanical force codes, not a transportation code. If a person is walking along, bumps into another person, falls, and is injured, the appropriate code would be one of the fall codes, W03, fall on the same level due to collision with another person. And finally, if a person is walking on snow or ice and slips or falls, then again, the appropriate code to use is a fall code, W00, fall due to ice and snow, not a transportation code. So again, there's some unique things about pedestrians. Pedestrians are sometimes considered in transportation and sometimes not. Next slide, please. Another concept related to pedestrians is the idea of pedestrian conveyances. And this concept is the same as that in ICD 9CM. So a pedestrian conveyance is when a person is moving under his or her own power, but there's also some type of device that helps them move from one point to another. And there's a lot of different types of these pedestrian conveyances. And in ICD 10CM, they've been sort of grouped into these different categories, such as a rolling type, which includes such things as roller skates, skateboards, non-motorized scooters, Heelys, that type of thing. There's a gliding type, which includes ice skates and sleds. There's a flat bottom type, such as snow skis and snowboards. And then there are these other types of pedestrian conveyances, such as wheelchairs, baby strollers, mobility scooters, that type of thing. Next slide. So in general, for events in which a person is on a pedestrian conveyance and gets injured, the event does not involve, So if it involves a person on a pedestrian conveyance who's injured, but the event does not involve a collision with another vehicle, the code range to look at is V00. The V00 codes include falls from the pedestrian conveyance, events where a person on a pedestrian conveyance collides with a stationary object, and other types of events that don't involve collision with another vehicle. So, for example, for an event involving a skier who falls while skiing, the code to use would be V00.321, fall from snow skis. If the skier hits a tree, the code to use would be V00.322, a snow skier colliding with a stationary object. And for those of you who see a fair number of skiing or snowboarding injuries, you might remember that in ICD 9CM, the ski and snowboard codes were included with falls. Same thing with roller skates and skateboards. Well, that's now changed in ICD 10CM. In ICD 10CM, all of the codes related to pedestrian conveyances are now included with the transportation codes and not with the fall codes. So keep that in mind when you're looking for codes related to skiing, snowboarding, skating, sledding, etc. Some things that used to be grouped with the falls are now included with transportation. So, what about those events where the person on the pedestrian conveyance collides with a vehicle? Well, in those events, if the person on the pedestrian conveyance collides with a vehicle of some type, then you should select the appropriate code in the V01 to V09 range, depending on the type of vehicle the pedestrian collided with. So, for example, for a person on roller skates who collides with a bicyclist in a traffic event, the appropriate code to use is V01.11. V for transportation, second character of 0 because the person who was hurt was a pedestrian, or in this case, person on a pedestrian conveyance. It was a person on roller skates. The third character of 1 for colliding with a pedal cyclist, and the fourth and fifth digits describing the details of the event. That is, that the pedestrian was on roller skates and that the event was traffic related. Again, the code for a person on roller skates who collides with a bicyclist in a traffic event, V01.11. Another example, a kid on a skateboard collides with a moving car in a parking lot. The appropriate code to use is V03.02. Pedestrian on skateboard, injured in collision with car in non-traffic accident. Again, V for transportation, second character of 0 for pedestrian or pedestrian conveyance for the person who was hurt, third character of 3 for colliding with a car, and then the fourth and fifth digits providing the additional details. That is, that the pedestrian was on a skateboard and that the event was non-traffic. The last thing I'd like to mention is that it makes a difference if the pedestrian conveyance is moving or not. So, for example, if someone falls from a moving wheelchair, you'd use a transportation code. If someone falls from a wheelchair that's not moving, you'd use a fall code. So for a fall from a moving wheelchair, you'd use V00.811. For a fall from a non-moving wheelchair, you'd use W05.0. Next slide, please. This concept of moving or not moving is important to keep in mind for all transportation events. So a transport accident is one in which the vehicle involved must be moving or running or in use for transport purposes at the time of the accident. If it's not being used for transport at the time of the event, then it's considered to be an object. So, for example, if someone is working in their garage and they have the car up on a jack and they're working underneath it, and the jack collapses and the car falls down and hits the guy in the chest, you would not use a transportation code. The car was not in use for transport at the time of the accident. For that sort of a scenario, the appropriate code to use would be W22.8, struck against or struck by other objects. Finally, there are a variety of supplemental codes that can provide additional information about a transport event. For example, if the injury resulted from deployment of the airbag, you should include the appropriate W22.1 code. There are specific location codes in the Y92.4 range that identify the type of street or roadway, and there are also specific activity codes in the Y93.C range that identify whether or not the person was using a cell phone or other electronic equipment at the time of the crash. Now, for medical records coders, it's recommended that these types of supplemental codes be used. But whether or not to include these in your trauma registry is sort of up to your own hospital's practices or state or ATS requirements. I just wanted to bring these to your attention. I'm not saying that you have to use them, but you should be aware that they exist. Next slide, please. So while we've covered many of the routine traffic crash types of events, I also want to mention that there are specific codes for special types of vehicles. And this table shows the code range for some of them. So there are particular codes for injuries resulting from animals being ridden, railway trains, powered streetcars, vehicles used mainly on industrial premises. So these are things like, those powered carts that are used in airports to get people from one gate to the next, or the baggage carts or other special equipment used at airports to haul luggage or load the plane. Things like forklifts, a coal car in a mine, those types of things. So those are mostly vehicles used on an industrial premise. There's also codes for special vehicles used primarily in agriculture, such as tractors or trailers, special construction vehicles, such as bulldozers or dump trucks or mechanical shovels. And then this last category, all-terrain or off-road motor vehicles. This one's sort of important because it also includes such things as ambulances and fire trucks. I know there's a lot of interest in injuries that result from ambulances. So if an event involved an ambulance, you might want to look at this series of codes. It also includes particular codes for snowmobiles, dune buggies, military vehicles, golf carts, go-karts, dirt bikes, all of that. So if the event involves some type of specialty vehicle, think about the range of codes of V80 to V86. Finally, if the event is one in which you know the person was injured in some type of land transport accident, but you really know nothing about the type of transport, look at the V87 to V89 codes, and that's the range that includes the unspecified codes. Next slide, please. So I know this probably seems like a lot on codes for land transportation, but part of the reason for going into it in so much detail is that the land transportation codes comprise a huge number of the ICD-10-CM codes. For example, of the 126 pages of external cause codes in the ICD-10-CM coding manual on the NCHS website, 51 pages, or 40% of Chapter 20, is devoted to these land transportation codes. So there's just a huge number of codes for transportation in ICD-10-CM. But hopefully the information about the structure of the code and the tips I've mentioned will help you get to the right place in the coding manual to get started in finding the best code for the type of event involved. So before moving to the next topic, let's open it up and see if there's any questions on the material I've covered so far. So Garrett, do we have any questions?
And Holly, at this time we have no questions.
I think it's either overwhelming amount of material or hopefully it's relatively clear. So let's hope that's the case. Okay, what is heavy transport? I'm seeing a question there on that. And so as I mentioned before, I would recommend that you look in the coding manual about the specific definition for heavy transport, but that has to do with heavy trucks. So like when you see semi-trucks on the highway, those big types of vehicles like that, those are what's considered heavy transport. Any other questions? All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. And we've just talked a lot about the land transportation codes, but there are also other transportation codes for water, air, and other types of transport events. And I'm not going to go into any detail on the air or other type of transport events. They're fairly straightforward and similar to those in ICD-9-CM. So I suggest you look at those on your own. But I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the water transport codes, because there are several things to keep in mind with regard to water transport. So when you're coding a water transport event, there are several key questions to answer in order to get to the right set of codes. So the first question is, was the person injured from drowning and submersion, or was the person injured in some other way, such as falling or being hit by a falling object or being crushed or burned or something else while they were on the watercraft? The second question is, what type of watercraft was involved? And I'll go over some categories here in a few minutes. And finally, the last question is whether or not the watercraft itself was damaged. By answering these questions, you'll be able to get to the right set of codes. So let's see how all of these concepts are put together. You can move to the next slide. So this table shows the code range for the different water transport codes, and the broad range is V90 to V94. And the first two rows in the table are for events in which the watercraft itself was damaged. The distinction between using V90 versus V91 is whether or not the person was injured from drowning and submersion, or if the person was injured by some other type of injury. The third and fourth rows are for events in which there was no damage to the watercraft. So again, here, the distinction between using V92 and V93 is whether or not the person was injured from drowning and submersion, or if they were injured in some other way. So these broad groups take into account two of the key questions I mentioned: how the person was hurt and whether or not the watercraft was damaged. What about that third question, the type of watercraft that was involved? Well, the details about the specific type of watercraft involved are embedded in the body of the code. So the next slide here shows a listing of some of the types of watercraft that can be identified using the water transport codes. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the types of watercraft vary from different types of boats and ships to sailboats, canoes, kayaks, rafts, surfboards, water skis, all kinds of things. So once you determine which of the broad categories to look at, that is the range of V90 to V94, you look at the details within the code to identify the specific type of watercraft involved. Next slide, please. So in addition to all of the specifics about the types of watercraft, the water transport codes also capture specifics about the event itself. So this slide shows a list of some of the specific types of events that are captured in the water transport codes. Everything from the watercraft sinking, to collisions between two watercrafts, to being thrown overboard, to fires and explosions on watercraft. So as you can imagine, with all of the details on the person, the type of watercraft, the type of event, whether or not the watercraft was damaged, there are a lot of codes to consider. Clearly, much more detail is captured in ICD 10-CM than in ICD 9-CM for injuries involving watercraft. But if you work your way through the codes and answer those 3 questions I mentioned earlier, you should be able to find the code you're looking for. So I now want to turn to the external causes of injury that are not transportation related. And I won't be spending as much time on the non-transportation codes. I'm mostly going to be highlighting things that are new or different in ICD 10-CM. So next slide, please. So the first category I want to address is falls. And in ICD 10-CM, codes for injuries resulting from falls are found in the code range of W00 to W19. And if you look through the coding manual, you'll see that most of the code concepts in the falls category are pretty similar to those in ICD 9-CM. But there are a few new things I want to mention. So I said this a little bit earlier, but there are now specific codes for falls resulting from walking on snow and ice. And so if that's the scenario that's involved, that somebody slipped and fell while walking on snow or ice, the code range that you should use is W00. There's now a new code, W04, for falls that occur while being carried or supported by another person. So, you know, for those events like when a parent is holding a child in their arms and the child falls out of their arms onto the floor or something like that, the code you would use is W04. And also something a little bit new in ICD 10-CM, there's now quite a few codes to describe injuries that result from falling, jumping, or diving into water. And different codes depending on the type of water. So the water can be in a swimming pool or a natural body of water such as a river or a lake, or a bucket of water or some other source of water such as a fountain. And there are different codes for just hitting the water surface versus hitting the bottom or the sides of a pool or a lake. So different codes for all those different scenarios. And there's also a distinction made between just falling into the water versus actively jumping or diving into the water. So again, many more options for codes about fall into water in ICD 10-CM compared to ICD 9-CM. And then the last fall code that I want to highlight is W17.82, which is falling from or out of a grocery cart. Again, that really wasn't available in ICD 9-CM, and those events clearly happen, so there is a specific code for that in ICD 10-CM. Next slide. So the next section of codes deals with events involving exposure to inanimate mechanical forces. And as I mentioned earlier, these are events that mostly involve objects of some type as opposed to live things, such as people or animals. And this table shows the range of codes for different types of injury events involving inanimate objects. And as you can see, many of these categories are very similar to those in ICD 9-CM. So you have the same categories of struck by or against, or caught or crushed between objects, machinery, sharp objects, firearms, tools, that sort of thing. So again, the concepts aren't really that different from ICD 9-CM, just a different label to the code. Next slide, please. But on this slide, I want to just highlight a few things that have been added in ICD-10-CM. So first off, there's a lot more detail captured on injuries resulting from being struck or hit by sports equipment. So this code, W21, has a lot of detail, not just whether the person was struck by a ball, for example, but there are different codes based on the type of ball. So there's a code for being struck by a football, by a soccer ball, by a baseball. There are different codes for being struck by different types of bats or rackets or sticks, being struck by shoe cleats or skate blades, by football helmets, by striking against a diving board. Just a lot of sports-related items not previously mentioned in ICD-9-CM. So a lot more detail on sports-related injuries can be captured here. As I mentioned before, there's a specific code for injuries resulting from deployment of airbags. In terms of injuries from machinery, there's now a specific code for injuries resulting from nail guns, W29.4. And then an important distinction that's now been added in ICD-10-CM is that in terms of injuries resulting from firearms, there are now separate codes to identify whether the injury resulted from discharge of the firearm versus injuries to the shooter who is using the gun. So now there are codes to capture injuries that might result from the shooter being injured because the gun exploded when it was fired, or that the shooter cut or pinched their finger or hand or something when they were operating some component of the gun, such as a slide trigger mechanism or a scope on the gun or something like that. There are codes that help identify injuries due to recoil of the gun or powder burns from the gun. So again, with these new codes, there are now ways to capture not only injuries from being shot, or from being on the receiving end of the bullet that was discharged from the gun, but also injuries that might have happened to the shooter who was operating the gun. So a lot of additional codes around firearm in the W32 to W34 range. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights a few concepts related to injuries resulting from exposure to animate mechanical forces, and that is mechanical injuries involving things that are alive. So this range of codes includes events involving being accidentally hit, struck, kicked, bit, scratched, pushed, crushed, stepped on by another person or by a crowd of people. So if events involve two people and they're accidental, look at this W50, W51, and W52. And it also includes a ton of codes about injuries from animals, reptiles, amphibians, arthropods, plants, birds. This is probably the category that has received the most attention from the media in terms of the number of unusual codes that have been added, because there are specific codes for each animal and for different types of events, like being bitten by the animal, or being kicked by the animal, or being sat on by the animal. And so, you know, I've listed some of the types of animals here, but there are many more than just these. So as you can imagine, this has led to a huge expansion in the number of animal-related codes. So I don't know that there are that many injuries coming from animals, but if there are, we can certainly capture all the details in ICD-10-CM. So next slide, please. So for most of the other external cause categories, and those are things like drowning and submersion, or exposure to electric current, or radiation, or hypothermia or hypothermia, injuries from smoke or fire or hot objects or liquids, or exposure to forces of nature like tornadoes or earthquakes or that sort of thing. Those are very similar between ICD-9-CM and ICD-10-CM. It's just that there's more codes available in 10-CM to capture all of the detail. Same thing with the injuries from other intents, that is from the suicide codes or the intentional self-harm codes, assault, undetermined intent, legal intervention, operations of war, and terrorism. All the codes there are very similar between 9-CM and 10-CM, just a lot more detail in 10-CM. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to be talking about each of these other external cause categories, But I do want to highlight just a few things to keep in mind that are relevant to some of these topic areas. So the first thing I want to mention is drowning and submersion. And we've talked about that a little bit previously with regard to watercraft. But of course, there can be drowning and submersion that isn't related to watercraft. So, if you're looking at an event that involved drowning, one of the first questions you want to ask yourself is, well, was watercraft involved or not? If watercraft was involved, then you should look at the transportation codes and use V90 or V92. But if there isn't any watercraft involved, a person drowned in a pool, or they drowned in a bucket, or drowned in a fountain, or something like that, then the code range to look at is W65 to W74. Similarly, injuries from excessive heat or excessive cold, there's a distinction made between whether or not the source of that heat or cold was man-made versus natural. So a man-made source would be like if somebody got trapped in a freezer, a walk-in freezer of some type, and so excessive cold, but it was a man-made source. Then the codes that you would use for excessive heat or cold from a man-made source are W92 or W93. If it's a natural source, like somebody is trapped outside at night and it's 10 degrees outside and they have hypothermia, if it's a natural source, it was just that they were out in a very cold environment, then the codes you would use would be X30 or X31. Another couple things to keep in mind, the assault codes in ICD-10-CM have a lot more options to identify who the perpetrator was in terms of assault, maltreatment, or neglect. So there's a lot more detail now in the Y07 codes. And finally, just a reminder again that there are some external causes, poisoning, asphyxiation, and foreign bodies in particular, that are now captured in T codes. Lightning is another one I think that comes up sometimes in trauma registries, and that also is now a T code. Next slide, please. So before we wrap up on the external cause codes, I just want to provide this reminder about the general principle for assigning external cause. This principle comes from the official coding guidelines from the National Center for Health Statistics and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And it's the same general principle that was in place with ICD-9-CM. So really nothing has changed, but it's a good reminder. So for people who do medical records coding, and for medical records coding, the sequence is really important. And the way that the sequence should be considered is that the first listed external cause code should correspond to the cause of the most serious diagnosis due to an assault, accident, or self-harm, but based on this hierarchy that's shown here. That is, the codes for child or adult abuse take precedence over codes for terrorism events, for cataclysmic events, for transport events, and then for other types of external causes. So, for example, if someone was driving their car in a tornado and the car was struck by a tree that was uprooted in a storm, the sequence of the codes would be X37.1 for a cataclysmic storm, specifically a tornado, followed by V48.5 for a car driver injured in a non-collision transport accident in traffic, and W20.8, other cause of strike by a thrown, projected, or falling object for being struck by the tree. So, again, following this priority here, you would list the cataclysmic event before the transport event, before the other external cause, which would be the struck by the tree. Next slide, please. So I now want to briefly move away from the external cause codes and talk about some of these supplemental codes that are available in ICD-10-CM. And these are supplemental codes that are relevant to injury. And as trauma registrars, I don't know if you'll be expected to use these codes, but I wanted to bring them to your attention. These are important for medical records coders. Trauma registrars might or might not need to consider these codes. And these are ones that capture information on alcohol involvement, the place where the injury occurred, the activity the person was doing at the time of the injury, and the work status of the person. And I'll kind of go into each of these in a little bit of detail. So next slide, please. So in ICD-10-CM, the Y90 codes can be used to capture blood alcohol level. And the different codes here correspond to different blood alcohol levels based on milligram per 100 mils. And I know most trauma registries use other variables to capture blood alcohol levels. You might not ever use this code in your trauma registry, but it's worth knowing that it exists in case there's any change in the future in terms of the codes that are included in your trauma registry. Next slide, please. The Y92 codes capture information on the place where the injury occurred. For those of you who might have used the E849 codes in ICD-9-CM, these are similar to those. But as with everything else, ICD-10-CM captures a lot more detail. So not only can you capture whether or not the injury occurred in a private residence, in a home, but whether it was in the kitchen, whether it was in the dining room, the bathroom, the bedroom, the garden, or some other place in the home. You know, for roadway events, there are specific codes for different types of roadways, such as interstates or parkways or state roads or local residential or business streets, or whether it was on an on-ramp or an off-ramp or on a sidewalk, in a parking lot, on a bike path. I mean, just a lot of detail about where the injury occurred. So a whole series of codes here within the place of occurrence code range. Next slide. In terms of activities, there's, again, a huge number of different codes here as well. I've just summarized the broad categories on this and on the next slide. I won't go into any of these in detail, but I highly suggest that you refer to a coding manual to see the variety of codes for different activities that are available. And some of these are sort of make sense. You know, it's clear that a lot of injuries happen with these. If you look on the next slide, there are some additional large categories of activity codes, and some of these I think are sort of interesting. I never really thought that one might be injured playing a musical instrument, but I guess that does happen. So there is particular codes, Y93.J, that whole series, and I'm sure in that body of codes they'll even get down to the type of instrument. So I guess if a piano fell on you, you would be able to capture that. So next slide, please. The final set of supplemental codes I want to mention is the status codes, the Y99 codes. And these codes are used to identify whether the injury involved civilian activity done for income or pay, if it involved military activity, whether it was occurred when somebody was volunteering, or some other status, such as participating in a hobby or a leisure activity not for pay, or if it happened when somebody was doing sports or recreation or something not for income, or some other type of activity like a student activity, you know, some activity at school, that type of thing. So again, I'm not sure you'll need to capture these codes in your trauma registry, but you should be aware that they exist. And you know, again, it's a good way, particularly for capturing information about whether or not an injury is work-related. So I think that's why CMS is recommending that these codes be used by the medical records coders. Next slide, please. So the final topic I want to mention is some work that's been done recently by the National Center for Health Statistics and the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at CDC. And this is the proposed ICD-10-CM external cause matrix. The external cause matrix is a way of sort of organizing all of these external cause codes by mechanism and intent of injury. And these types of external cause matrices have been developed in the past for both the ICD-9-CM external cause codes and the ICD-10 codes. And the ICD-10 codes are those that are used for deaths. So ICD-10 and 10-CM are slightly different. So the ICD-10 codes are used for deaths. ICD-10-CM are used for non-fatal events. The report at this website describes the process that was used to come up with the proposed external cause matrix for ICD-10-CM. And it also includes a lot of useful background information about the ICD-10-CM external cause codes. So even if you don't use a matrix, it might be worth taking a look at this report to learn more about the external cause codes. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the matrix is a way of sort of organizing the external cause codes by mechanism and by intent of injury. So in the matrix, the columns represent the different injury intents. So you'll see unintentional or accidental, intentional self-harm, assault, undetermined intent, and legal intervention in operations of war. The rows in the matrix represent the different broad categories of mechanisms of injury. So for example, you'll see cut, pierce, drowning in submersion, fall, fire, flame, firearm, that type of thing. So once those rows and columns of the matrix are set, then what we did was take all the V, W, X, Y, and T codes and distribute those throughout the different cells of this matrix based on both the mechanism and the intent of the injury. Okay. At this point, the ICD-10-CM external cause matrix is still considered to be in draft form because we haven't had a chance to test it using real ICD-10-CM coded data. So until we can do that further testing, we don't really consider it final. However, it does provide a starting place for conversation as we begin this transition from ICD-9-CM to ICD-10-CM. So why is it important to trauma registrars? Well, in the past, the ATS and the National Trauma Data Bank have used the external cause matrix to assign trauma type, that is, whether or not an injury is considered as blunt versus penetrating trauma. And they've taken the external cause codes that were assigned by the registrars and used sort of a translation table to sort of say, well, if it had this code, it was a blunt injury. If it had that code, it was a penetrating injury. So I don't know if they plan to do that with ICD-10-CM, but it's something to keep in mind. I think there's been some initial conversations on this planned, but at this moment, I have not heard of anything definite, and so I can't really give you any details. But if your hospital sends data to the National Trauma Data Bank, you might want to keep this on your radar, particularly once they've made a decision about whether or not they're going to use the matrix, and then also, you know, how do they do that translation between external cause code to trauma type. So again, just a few things to sort of keep in mind. Next slide, please. So this wraps up the material that I wanted to cover. And I hope this webinar has been useful for you and that you've learned more about the ICD-10-CM external cause codes and some of the tips for assigning the correct code. You know, this transition from ICD-9-CM to ICD-10-CM is going to be a learning experience for all of us. I mean, I don't think anybody sort of feels 100% comfortable exactly about how are we going to work with these ICD-10-CM codes and all the changes that are resulting from that. But please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the ICD-10-CM codes, or if you start using the codes and you come up with ideas about new codes that should be added. You know, it's a work in progress. There's a full mechanism for adding new codes if they're needed, and I would be more than happy to work with folks who have ideas for new codes or if they have questions about the existing codes. So with that, thanks again for this opportunity, and I hope this has been a useful seminar for you. And with that, I think we could open up to any questions people might have. So Garrett, any questions so far?
I believe we do have one question. However, this question is more specific to coding, and we just wanted to let everyone know that we do see those questions specific to coding, whether this one in particular is, can you give us a code comparison between someone struck by a baseball bat accidentally versus assaulted? And if that's too specific, Holly, then we can just get back to this person in the online forum.
No, I can. Yeah, let me. I have to pull open the coding manual because I have to admit that with 7,500 codes, I haven't memorized them all. So.
So in this case,
just a second here, and I can tell you that for that one by being struck by a baseball bat accidentally, the appropriate code to use is W21.11, so W21.11. That's the accidental code. And for being struck by a baseball bat as part of a assault, then the appropriate code to use would be Y00, which is assault by blunt object. So you can't get down to the detail of that it was a baseball bat. You just use a generic code of Y00, assault by blunt object. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Holly.
Other questions?
That is all the questions that we have in the queue. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Ian to wrap up the webinar. Ian, are you available?
Thank you, Garrett, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the webinar. I want to take an opportunity to specifically thank Dr. Hedegaard, who provided us with a really terrific educational opportunity today. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the ATS website beginning tomorrow. If you weren't able to download a copy of the handouts or the course slides, they are available on the control panel and also will be available on the ATS website under My ATS tomorrow morning. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Please make sure to check back with the ATS and our calendar for up-to-date opportunities for professional development. We look forward to offering you some additional opportunities and resources in the fall. And again, thank you to Dr. Hedegaard and to Garrett Hall for organizing today's event. And we will conclude there. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon.